a game-changing bipartisan piece of legislation that has provided life-saving assistance to women across America for nearly 3 decades. I'd like to start things off with a video that provides an overview of the legacy of this law.
I was a shelter director in North Florida in 1993 when Congress was debating the Violence Against Women Act. And I remember standing in this shelter and thinking to myself, after the Violence Against Women Act passes, this will all change. And indeed, it has.
The original 1994 law provided grants for legal aid and transitional housing for victims of domestic violence. It also created funding for law enforcement training and assistance hotlines.
First passed in 1994 after intense lobbying from women who had few legal protections and few resources against domestic and sexual violence. The bill is said to have decreased domestic violence for women by 70%, and it's bipartisan.
Vawa has been instrumental in safeguarding women and children from abuse, anguish, violence, and has resulted in the saving of millions of lives.
Nothing could be more related to the administration of justice than the Violence Against Women Act. Judges across the country are enlightened and prepared to deal with domestic violence.
And you can directly connect that to this law?
We've seen almost a 50% increase in reporting. More victims reaching out. They're calling the police. They know their services available and they're getting help.
Why now? Is there something you sense in this moment, in the midst of the pandemic?
Laws have to evolve.
We have made enormous progress in this country in addressing domestic violence. We have seen decreases of about 2/3 in the last 25 to 30 years. But as you point out, we're starting to see an increase again.
92% of women murdered in 2018 were killed by men they knew.
COVID-19 has only made the issue worse.
1 in 3 women have experienced either physical and or sexual intimate partner violence or non-partner sexual violence.
The bill is passed.
For more than 30 years, October has been recognized as Domestic Violence Awareness Month. It's a reminder that all of us have an obligation to stand up and support survivors of sexual and domestic violence, many of whom had to nurse their wounds, both physical and emotional, in silence. And over the past 18 months, many survivors have been forced into the most vulnerable position of all, isolated at home with an abuser. During this pandemic, nearly 4 in 10 rape crisis centers and nearly half of the YMCA's domestic violence programs have reported an increase in demand for services. Police departments throughout the country have also reported a spike in arrests and calls related to domestic violence. In my home state of Illinois, our domestic violence hotline experienced a 16% increase in calls in 2020, sometimes fielding 150 calls in a single day. A friend of mine and vocal advocate for survivors of domestic violence, the late Sheila Wellstone, used to say, and I quote her, "I find it absolutely intolerable to think that a woman's home can be the most violent, most dangerous, and oftentimes the most deadly place she can be." This is unacceptable reality for far too many women in America. And that's why the Senate must reauthorize and strengthen the law that for nearly 30 years has transformed the way we address sexual and domestic violence in America, the Violence Against Women Act. In the years since it was first signed into law, Vawa, as it's often referred to, has changed and even saved countless lives. It has opened up new avenues of support and relief for survivors, including domestic abuse hotlines. It has helped establish protocols for doctors, police officers, judges, and others to spot the subtle signs of domestic violence and to provide help once they observe those signs. And it has funded resources that allow victims to escape abusive environments. Unfortunately, in the last Congress, the Senate failed to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act. While appropriations to VAWA programs have continued, which is good news, much-needed efforts to improve the law stalled. Thankfully, in this Congress, there is a strong bipartisan commitment to join our colleagues in the House and pass VAWA of 2021. Today, the committee will have a chance to hear from the junior senator from Iowa, Senator Ertz. She's been working closely with Senator Feinstein and me to prepare the Senate's own version of the Vawa Reauthorization Act of 2021 for introduction. Senator Ernst, thank you so much. We'll also hear from Senators Leahy, Hyde-Smith, and Capito. We're then going to have a chance to hear from the Deputy Attorney General, Lisa Monaco, a law enforcement leader who has voiced strong support for this legislation as well. I had a conversation on the phone last night with Lisa, and she mentioned that she started her career on the Hill as an intern in this committee, working on the original VAWA. It inspired her to go to law school and to embark on a career of public service, which has been remarkable. So Lisa, I'm glad you're back home again. I want to personally thank Senators Ernst and Feinstein for their tireless efforts. Senator Feinstein, because of a serious illness in the family, could not join us this morning, but she is here in spirit, and we salute all of her leadership. A number of our colleagues on this measure have included Senator Leahy, who we expect to be here momentarily and make a statement, and Senator Amy Klobuchar, who has also been an invaluable contributor to this effort. I'm grateful for the shared commitment to produce a strong bipartisan bill. In March, the House once again passed a VAWA reauthorization with strong bipartisan support from the indomitable Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, House Judiciary Committee Chair Nadler, and Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick. Like the House-passed bill, our legislation will modernize and improve this vital law, and it won't roll back the progress that we've made. This new version of Violence Against Women Act will not only provide funding to organizations and resources that support survivors, it will invest in critical prevention and education. It will improve access to services for survivors in rural areas and those who require culturally specific services. It will enhance protections for Native American women and children. It will help keep dangerous weapons out of the hands of abusers, and it will provide survivors with the support they need by expanding access to legal services and other crucial programs. And once we join the House in passing this legislation, we know we're going to send it to the desk of a leader who is sympathetic, not just sympathetic, but wildly supportive of this measure. The man who originally sponsored the first Violence Against Women Act, President Joe Biden. I can think of no better way for us to do our part in honoring Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Now I turn to Ranking Member Grassley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I welcome all the witnesses and guests to our hearing on VAWA today. I supported enactment of the original VAWA Act that was in 1994 and have voted to reauthorize the grant programs authorized by VAWA multiple times. When I wasn't able to support a Democrat-led effort to reauthorize, I introduced my own proposal that would have protected and enhanced the program. This year, I again led my colleagues in sending a letter to the Senate appropriators urging that Congress continue to prioritize funding of the VAWA programs. In previous years, when I sent similar letters to appropriators, Senator Shelby and Leahy, leaders of the appropriators, were incredibly responsive to my requests and supportive of these programs, so I want to thank them for working with me to champion the funding. As a member of this committee, I've made it a top priority to champion related measures to expand the rights and services for victims of intimate partner violence. This year, for example, I joined a number of committee members in co-sponsoring legislation to ensure that the Crime Victims Fund will receive an additional $1 billion in deposits each and every year. Services to the victims and survivors of intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and child abuse are accorded priority funding under the Victims of Crime Act, which created this important fund. In 2016 and again this year, I also worked closely with young sexual survivor, assault survivor Amanda Wynn and the organization she founded on bills to enhance the right of sexual violence survivors in criminal justice system. In early 2018, I led this committee's effort to press the FBI for information in response to allegations of sexual abuse lodged against Olympic athletes against their former team doctor. I've been seeking justice for victims of Larry Naster's abuse, and I have some timely questions for DOJ, who refused to attend our hearing last month about accountability for those who failed these victims. As former chairman of the committee, I also worked closely with Senator Feinstein on legislation to impose mandatory reporting requirements on coaches and instructors who witness abuse when working with young athletes. I also sponsored and led this committee in approving legislation to renew and update the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, as many of the victims of sexual trafficking also are victims of intimate partner violence. I worked with Senator Cornyn on the Justice of Victims of Trafficking Act, shepherding it through this committee in the Senate, and led our committee in approving a measure sponsored by former Senator Hatch to make more resources available for the victims of child pornography. Renewing and extending Vawa is our next priority, and that's why we've convened this hearing today. Before we begin, I want to take this opportunity to mention now that it's Domestic Violence Awareness Month, that it's important that we adopt an extension of VAWA. A Senate-passed reauthorization could include the language on which we've reached consensus, and meanwhile, we could continue to engage in negotiations on additional important reforms and updates of VAWA. I also want to recognize several of my Republican colleagues who are not members of our committee, but have joined us here to testify today. Senator Ernst, Hyde-Smith, Capito, I thank you for being here, and I'd like to thank Ms. Monaco for attending today's hearing on behalf of the Department of Justice.
Thanks, Senator Grassley. Let me lay out the mechanics of the hearing. We'll begin with member panel, and each senator will have 3 minutes of opening statements. After that, Deputy Attorney General Monaco will testify, and she will have 5 minutes. We'll turn to questions from senators, and each senator will have 5 minutes for questioning. Before we begin, I also want to note again that Senator Feinstein is unable to be here, but has submitted a statement from the record which will be included without objection, and we are all, on both sides of the aisle, grateful for her amazing leadership on this bill and hearing as chair of the Subcommittee on Human Rights and the Law. So we'll first begin with a statement from Senator Ernst, who I mentioned earlier has worked closely with Senator Feinstein and myself to get this bill introduced and acted into law. We're glad you're here today. Senator Ernst, please proceed.
Thank you very much, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, members of the Senate Judiciary Committee. The Violence Against Women Act is now over 25 years old. As many of us are aware, this law provides desperately needed resources to tackle domestic and sexual abuse in our communities. And as too often the case with programs like VAWA, authorization has lapsed. But despite that reality, year after year, VAWA programs continue to be funded by Congress. I am a survivor myself. I know firsthand the paralyzing fear that comes when someone you trust abuses you. But you don't have to be a survivor to understand just how awful violence against women can be in terms of physical and mental well-being, in terms of self-image, in terms of our families, and in terms of the security of our society as a whole. I wasn't in the Senate in 2013, the last time Congress authorized VAWA, but since I've been here, I've had a vested interest in being part of the process and getting this vitally important bill modernized and reauthorized, because I believe we can always improve the Violence Against Women Act for our survivors. For months, I've worked closely with Chairman Durbin and Senator Feinstein, along with Senators Cornyn, Murkowski, Klobuchar, and Ranking Member Grassley, on a bipartisan bill that would not only reauthorize VAWA, but truly modernize it. We're not there yet, but good things in the Senate often take time. We will keep working until we come to a bill that won't just be a talking point for one side or the other, but a bill that can pass the Senate and the House become a law, and truly deliver for my fellow survivors. A modernized Violence Against Women Act that will pass the Senate must present a renewed focus on rural survivors and invest in proven programs that reduce violence. When you live in an area like mine, rural Montgomery County, Iowa, with a population of just over 10,000 people, the nearest shelter is an hour away in Council Bluffs. We've got to fix that. We must provide better resources for survivors in their own communities. We must also extend critical housing protections to rural communities, allowing survivors protection and security. It's a critical lifeline and a way out of these abusive situations. We also have to focus on successful efforts to prevent sexual violence, like the Rape Prevention and Education Program. Instead of reacting to these horrific crimes, this program works to prevent them from happening in the first place. Not only that, we must ensure not just that survivors are empowered, but that offenders are punished. My goal has always been to empower survivors, punish abusers, and enhance the overall purpose behind this important law. I will continue working with my Democratic partners, folks on this committee, and stakeholders to reach a bill that will help prevent what happened to me from ever happening to another woman. It's a lofty goal, but why else are we here? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Ernst. I see Senator Hyde-Smith has arrived, but Senator Capito, would you like to start? And then
Thank you,
we'll
Mr.
recognize your
Chairman.
colleague.
I appreciate Chairman Durbin and Ranking Member Grassley for having this hearing today, and I'm proud to be here for this important hearing, Strengthening the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA. I'd like to begin by thanking all of the people that work in this area across our country. This is tough work. It's so important, and I want to make sure that, and thanking our survivors for their ability to fight back against the scourge. Ending domestic violence and other VAWA-related crimes has been a priority of mine since I became a senator, but also as a congresswoman. As a matter of fact, the first time I ever came over to the Senate was to join with then Senator Biden to celebrate one of the reauthorizations in the early 2000s. I've also previously served as the chairman of the board of a local organization that worked to combat domestic violence. That's the YWCA in Charleston, West Virginia. But this work would not be possible without the funding and support that VAWA provides, and why it's critical that this bill be reauthorized. I was told by a leader in West Virginia that these funds are a lifeline to their work. As a member of the Appropriations Committee, I'm proud that we've consistently championed and in many cases increased the amount of money available for services for survivors of domestic and sexual violence in a bipartisan fashion. Now that the Office of Violence Against Women has announced the most recent round of grant funding, I am a bit concerned about how the Department of Justice is allocating some resources. Senator Ernst alluded to this a bit. Specifically, my state of West Virginia, while we have great challenges, we are accorded, I want to make sure we're accorded sufficient priority under existing statutory funding. As the only state that lost population, the population-based metrics are not helpful to meet those demands. One of my concerns that VAWA formulas may require updating to better reflect the needs of our nation's rural populations. I'm also concerned about the plight of service providers that are struggling to recover economically post-COVID. They need our help now more than ever. I urge the Department of Justice to update, to the maximum extent possible, its allocation methods to better reflect the needs of rural and remote areas, where many victims have unique challenges to reporting these crimes and seeking assistance. VAWA reauthorization has historically been a bipartisan effort, has been discussed today, and I'm happy to see many of my colleagues present with us today, demonstrating that willingness to work together to get survivors of domestic violence the resources they need. We can pass this bill, which encompasses the provisions on which already there is widespread bipartisan consensus. Doing so would not end our conversation or our work on behalf of victims and survivors, because we know there are things we must continually improve to meet the needs and challenges. I would also like to thank Senators Feinstein and Ernst for their dedicated movement to get this passed. For example, a few years ago, human trafficking was not a great concern in my state, but sadly, now it is. In addition to the challenges presented by COVID, we continue to be overwhelmed by the impact of an opioid epidemic. We are all here today with a shared goal, because I've heard from individuals and organizations that need our help. we can provide that help. I'm ready to work together during Domestic Violence Awareness Month and beyond to see this goal accomplished so that we can continue to empower victims, support our survivors, and protect families in every single one of our states. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Capito. Senator Leahy has dispensed with his responsibilities on the floor of the Senate and is able to join us, and he'll be followed by Cindy Hyde-Smith, Senator from Mississippi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I had to open the Senate this morning, and there was a little bit of delay in my replacement getting there, but we're here, and I want to thank you and Ranking Member Grassley for holding this hearing. The Violence Against Women Act has been a bedrock of the federal government's response to domestic violence and sexual assault since it was enacted in 1994. As one who was here at that time, I know that's one of the most consequential pieces of legislation within our committee's jurisdiction. But with our evolving world, there came a need to not only reauthorize the law, but to update and strengthen it as well. In 2013, we passed a strong bipartisan Violence Against Women Act reauthorization. I was chairman of the committee, and it was a top priority of mine. I proudly partnered with Senator Crapo, and we did just that. We put together a bipartisan bill. It's co-sponsored by 62 senators. It passed the Senate overwhelmingly with 78 votes. And some thought that we should water it down to make it easier to pass. Senator Crapo and I stood with the survivors and victim service professionals who called for legislation to protect all victims, regardless of their immigration status, their sexual orientation, or their membership in an Indian tribe. Unfortunately, I'm far less satisfied with how the Senate failed to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act since 2013. Nearly 2 years have already passed since I joined my friend Senator Feinstein in introducing the last reauthorization, which also passed the House with a strong vote of Republicans and Democrats. And I'm glad that under the new Senate leadership, we seem to be working in a more diligent bipartisan manner, and we're set to introduce a broadly supported Senate Vawa bill very soon. But this is not about politics, it's about listening to survivors and ensuring that those on the front lines working to prevent domestic and sexual violence have all the tools we need. There's incredible dangers and stresses with COVID. As one who's gone to crime scenes when I was a prosecutor and seen women who'd been beaten to death, and then we find that this has been going on for some time, but there's no place to report it, nothing to do. Now that was nearly 50 years ago. We can do a lot better, and we do. But I still remember every one of those scenes, like it was yesterday. Social distancing pushed many survivors living with their abusers further into isolation during COVID. Victim service providers are struggling to meet increasing housing and economic needs. The programs that Vawa supports make a real difference to these survivors and to their families. We owe it to work with them and introduce a strong bipartisan bill without delay. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the courtesy to let me go forward.
Thanks, Senator Leahy, for your leadership over the years for this important legislation. Senator Hyde-Smith.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin and Ranking Member Grassley. I certainly appreciate the opportunity to be here today to speak for the women who are experiencing these situations. My concerns are a lot like Senator Capito's. As we consider this reauthorization, I certainly want us to look at what I feel like is an overlooked population, the survivors of intimate partner violence who reside in rural areas. It's a lot harder to get access to things. These are the particular challenges faced by so many victims and survivors of domestic violence in my state of Mississippi. Before even making the decision to seek help, these survivors, most often women, have to overcome cultural norms which prioritize family privacy, which is very important in rural areas, traditional gender roles, and keeping their families together. When they do decide to get help, they'll have to travel long distances to receive it and will have fewer transportation options to get there in many instances. By one account, more than 25% of the women in rural settings reside at least 40 miles from the closest service provider, compared to less than 1% in rural and urban areas. Perhaps the most daunting due to geographic isolation, these survivors, they don't have the ability to remain anonymous that they wish that they would have when they're seeking their help, and they're so concerned of what the community will think of them. All of us in Congress can agree that our goal should be to ensure that these women in rural areas, and indeed all victims of sexual abuse, domestic violence, and stalking, are protected and they receive the services that they need. To this end, these programs are funded generously each and every year by the Appropriations Committee, which I serve on. Earlier this year, we also came together as a chamber and unanimously adopted a measure to significantly increase deposits into the Crime Victims Fund. This cooperative achievement will go a long way to sustaining the fund over time, but we need to harness that same cooperative spirit now. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, a time when we should come together to develop bipartisan relationships to address this and have meaningful chances that this will be signed into law by the President. But we're not yet there, and that's extremely frustrating. The other chamber this year passed a reauthorization bill that has little chance of reaching 60 votes in this chamber. That bill is yet to overcome objectives from prosecutors who fear it will limit their abilities to successfully pursue repeat offenders of domestic violence. It is yet to address concerns that it could destabilize some states' unemployment systems. It has yet to address provisions that may reduce giant grant eligibility for providers serving victims of elder abuse or commercial sexual exploitation. And ironically, the bill's gender identity provisions could make it more challenging for grant recipients to best to serve the rape victims and sex trafficking victims for whom they provide space to heal emotionally and physically. Therefore, I call on this committee and Senate leadership to adopt the reauthorization bill this month that embodies language on which we agree, including a greater emphasis on serving victims in rural areas. In the meantime, I believe we should continue to work together in good faith to resolve the remaining areas where we've yet to reach consensus. We need to do it for the sake of survivors, of victims of domestic and sexual violence everywhere. Thank you for allowing me to be here to speak on such an important issue. I certainly appreciate it.
Thank you, Senator Hyde-Smith. And Senator Capito, before you leave, I want to make a shameless plug for our Rise from Trauma Act bill that you've joined me in introducing to effectively treat the root causes of violence by focusing on the impact that exposure to trauma has on our children and providing them the services they need to help heal. Thank you so much for being co-sponsor. Thank you for joining us this morning. We now are going to call before us Lisa Monaco. Let me get to the appropriate page here so I don't say the wrong thing at this moment. As the witness table is being prepared, I welcome Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco. Before you sit down, let me administer the oath, if I might. Do you affirm the testimony you are about to give before the committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you very much. Note that the Deputy Attorney General answered in the affirmative. She serves as the Justice Department's second-ranking official. She's responsible for the overall supervision of the department. In this role, Deputy Attorney General Monaco advises and assists the Attorney General in formulating and implementing the department's policies and programs. She was confirmed by the Senate with bipartisan support in April, previously served as a career federal prosecutor in several leadership positions across the department, served as Homeland Security and Counterterrorism Advisor to President Obama, born and raised in Massachusetts, graduate of Harvard and the University of Chicago Law School. Deputy General, please proceed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Grassley, members of the committee. I appreciate very much this opportunity to speak to you today. The Violence Against Women Act has had an enormous impact in combating domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. And I'm here to urge Congress to reauthorize and to strengthen it. Before we get started, though, Mr. Chairman, with your indulgence, I would like to recognize several tragedies that the Department of Justice has suffered in recent days. Yesterday in Tucson, Arizona, a DEA agent was shot and killed, and a second DEA agent and a task force officer were shot and wounded. Separately, last Friday, a deputy U.S. Marshal succumbed to injuries from a vehicle accident that occurred while he was assisting with a law enforcement operation. These sacrifices remind all of us of the risks law enforcement takes every day to protect the communities that they serve. My thoughts and prayers are with their families and the men and the women of the DEA and the U.S. Marshals Service. Now, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Grassley, the original passage of the Violence Against Women Act in 1994, as you have noted, Mr. Chairman, had a major impact on my own life. At the time, I was a young staff member on this committee working for then Chairman Biden, and one of my responsibilities included responding to letters from people who wrote to the committee. Time and again, I read firsthand accounts not only about the violence that too many people, mostly women, suffered at the hands of their intimate partners, but also about the lack of accountability for these crimes. Statistics the committee reported during that period painted a very grim picture. 98% of rape victims never saw their attacker caught, tried, and imprisoned, meaning almost all of the perpetrators of rape walked free. Fewer than half of the people arrested for rape were convicted, and almost half of convicted rapists could expect to serve only a year or less in jail. My conversations with individual survivors, rape crisis centers, domestic violence shelters, emergency rooms, and police stations put a human face on those statistics. And that experience led me to want to go to law school, Mr. Chairman. And it led me into public service, and it drew me to a career in law enforcement and criminal justice. With the passage of Vawa, I saw how a law could make a real difference in people's lives, and I saw what Congress could accomplish through thoughtful policy, driven by courageous voices, experts, and bipartisan leadership. Congress reauthorized Vawa in 2000, 2005, 2013, each time with bipartisan support. Over the years, we've made substantial progress, but the need for Vawa's programs and protections is as critical as ever. And I'd like to highlight just a few of the items the Department of Justice sees as priorities for the reauthorization bill. First, reauthorizing Vawa's vitally important grant programs at the $1 billion funding levels included in the President's fiscal year 2022 request. This will ensure communities can provide critical services to survivors, as well as the right tools and training to make sure that responses to these crimes are survivor-centered and trauma-informed. And I'm pleased to announce today that the Office of Violence Against Women has issued this year more than $476 million in grants to help state, local, and tribal organizations support survivors as they heal, promote victim access to justice, and train professionals to respond to domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. Second, we need to find new ways to reach and improve services for underserved populations, including culturally specific communities. Third, expanding the ability of tribes to protect their communities from domestic and sexual violence through expanded jurisdiction. And fourth, reducing homicides through federal firearms laws, including by closing the so-called boyfriend loophole that leaves countless victims at risk. Now, before I take your questions, Mr. Chairman, I want to speak to two recent issues that have received considerable national attention and which I think underscore the continued importance of Vawa. The tragic murder of Gabby Petito has been at the forefront of many people's minds. While I won't speak to the ongoing investigation regarding her death, I am struck by two critical lessons we should take away from the publicly reported information, not just in this case, but in the thousands of other cases that don't receive public attention. First is the importance of the bystander's 911 call, which prompted law enforcement to respond to reports of violence between Ms. Petito and her boyfriend. The second, as we learned from watching the public video footage of interviews conducted by those officers, is the vital importance of having trained law enforcement who understand the dynamics of domestic violence when responding to such incidents. But we should not forget that Gabby Petito is not alone. there are more than 89,000 missing persons cases in this country, and roughly 45% of them involve people of color, including too many missing and murdered Indigenous persons. Now, gender-based violence is too often a precursor to these cases, and while these cases often don't receive public attention, the Department of Justice will continue its work to prevent these crimes and to bring perpetrators to justice. Finally, I want to recognize the many courageous women athletes who have spoken out and testified on behalf of the hundreds of survivors of Larry Nassar's horrific sexual abuse, and most recently, the 4 brave women athletes who came before this committee last month. I also want to thank this committee for its work and that of the Inspector General in bringing to light a system that inexcusably failed them and the scores of other survivors. As the Deputy Attorney General, as a lawyer, as a former FBI official, and as a woman, I was outraged by the Inspector General's findings, and I was horrified at the experiences Simone Biles, Michaela Maroney, Maggie Nichols, and Allie Reisman recounted in their powerful testimony. I am deeply sorry that in this case, the victims did not receive the response or the protection that they deserved. I've discussed with the FBI director the full scope of the changes he's instituting to ensure this never happens again. I've also directed additional measures inside the Department of Justice to ensure that where there is an ongoing threat, violence or abuse, especially when that involves vulnerable victims, that our prosecutors understand that they have a duty to coordinate with other local law enforcement partners to address it. And I've made clear that it is a priority of the Department of Justice to provide victims and witnesses of crime the support that they need. My experience working on Vawa for this committee many years ago taught me a key principle that guides me still today. Our government has a moral obligation to protect its citizens. And when it falls short in that effort, we must listen to those who we have let down to better understand where we can improve. Survivors who come forward to report abuse must be met with competent and compassionate professionals who have the resources, training, and institutional support to do their jobs. That's the promise of Vawa, and one the Department of Justice is committed to carrying out in our own organization and in Vawa-funded programs and work throughout the country. I appreciate the time and attention of the many members of Congress who've contributed to this important legislation, many for decades. I look forward to continuing that work with this committee and to answering your questions today. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Attorney General. It's been my honor to serve on this committee for over 20 years. 3 weeks ago, we heard, as you recounted, the incredibly compelling and heartbreaking testimony from 4 survivors of sexual violence who were abused by disgraced USA gymnastics team Dr. Larry Nassar. The reaction across the nation to that testimony was incredible, resounding, powerful. The American people want child predators like Larry Nassar and anyone who aids in their crimes held accountable. The Department of Justice has a special responsibility in this regard. We had the director of the FBI present during the entire testimony of the gymnast, and he testified later, I think making no excuses for what they experienced when they finally summoned the courage to bring their grievance to the proper legal authorities. The FBI failed them. Our government failed them. We failed them, and it was very clear. In addition to managing millions of dollars in funds earmarked for survivors of abuse, the Department of Justice oversees individual prosecutions of predators and their abettors. Many people, including myself and my colleagues and the gymnasts who testified, expressed shock and dissatisfaction with the department's decision to decline prosecution of the FBI agents who not only mishandled the Nassar investigation, but clearly lied to the Inspector General's office. People are charged with the crime of lying to the government and are held accountable, and some are imprisoned for the very acts which appear to have taken place here. And yet, the decision not to prosecute is one which most of us clearly don't understand. What is your response to the criticism over the department's decision not to prosecute these FBI agents? If the department is committed to bringing justice to survivors of sexual violence, what is your plan to better demonstrate that commitment going forward?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me reiterate, the survivors who testified so bravely last month deserved better than they got from the FBI and from the Justice Department. The IG documented inexcusable, unacceptable failures, some of them quite fundamental failures, a lack of urgency, a lack of care for the victims who we have a duty to protect. It is a core mission of the department to protect those victims, and as you know, the FBI director testified about a number of measures he's putting in place, from strengthened policy, strengthened training, mandatory reporting when such abuse comes to light in the future. And I've also put in place the measures I referenced in my opening statement. Now, with regard to the understandable interest and frustration with regard to the department's longstanding policy to protect appropriate decision-making and not commenting on declination decisions, I can inform the committee today that the recently confirmed Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division is currently reviewing this matter, including new information that has come to light. In light of that review, I think you'll understand, Mr. Chairman, that I'm constrained in what more I can say about it, but I do want the committee, and frankly, I want the survivors to understand how exceptionally seriously we take this issue and believe that this deserves a thorough and full review.
I might ask you this, is there any sense of urgency or timetable to this new criminal review about the wrongdoing by the FBI agents?
We take exceptionally seriously our duty to protect victims. And yes, I think you can be assured there is a sense of urgency and gravity with the work that needs to be done.
I'd like to ask you about one other issue in the remaining minute. I mentioned while she was still here that Senator Capito and I have co-sponsored legislation, the Rise from Trauma Act. When you read the statistics of the number not only of spouses, but children of those spouses who are either victims of violence or exposed to violence in their lifetime, it is a showstopper. As a parent, you think back on the experiences of your own youth and those memorable events. Hopefully, God willing, they are positive memories, but in many cases they're not. And there's a scar on the souls and minds of these children that has to be addressed, or we see terrible outcomes. We're going through a spate of gun violence across America and in the city of Chicago, which I dearly love, which is just incredible. And you wonder, who are these kids that get so mixed up with the gangs and turn to guns and violence, the fight or flight syndrome and everything that follows? What can you tell me about your announcement this morning, additional resources that are going toward the issue of dealing with trauma?
Well, Mr. Chairman, as you know, one of the founding principles of the Violence Against Women Act, when it was first enacted in 1994 and continuing on for 25 years, has been to ensure that prosecutors, court systems, victim advocates, and all who encounter children who are exposed to violence in the home, victims themselves of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, dating violence, to ensure that when they encounter the system in all of its myriad forms, that those individuals receive the service that they are due, meaning that service providers, the prosecutors, the judges have been trained to understand the unique experience that a survivor of domestic violence or children exposed to violence in the home, what that trauma is like and how that should impact their movement, if you will, and what they get in the system. They shouldn't be re-traumatized, Mr. Chairman, by coming forward and by seeking to hold their perpetrator accountable.
I've gone over my time, and I'm sorry. Just to close by saying, but resources have to be available for analysis, for counseling, for remediation, for mentorship, to give these kids a second chance. Otherwise, I'm sorry to say the results are going to be terrible. And so I'm glad to work with you and the Attorney General and the President on that issue. Senator Grassley.
Yeah, before I start my questions, I want to emphasize what's been said here, and you've already responded to it as positively and update as you could about reconsidering prosecution of these people that weren't doing their job and taking action appropriate. I sent a letter to Attorney General Garland along the same line, the very same day I think that we had this hearing. Now to my first question. It starts out with the fact that Vawa's passed the House of Representatives. On that bill, certain prosecutor groups have flagged for us something concerning with that. Business community has raised questions about unemployment benefits that are in that program could undermine the stability of the unemployment system. I hope that we can reach a bipartisan agreement to move a bill forward. Short of that, I hope we can continue to do what we've done to reauthorize Vawa because it's a very important program that must be continued. So my question is based on the fact that I believe 90 to 95% of what's on the table in regard to Vawa is agreed to. But then there's certain outstanding things. Is the department supportive of ensuring that the existing VAWA programs are extended, for example, through the end of the year so that the bipartisan negotiations can continue on a longer-term reauthorization message?
Well, Mr. Ranking Member, first I want to thank you for your support in the past of the reauthorization of VAWA and the exceptionally important provisions, not only the major funding and the formula grant programs and important grant programs that provide services to victims, but also the rural grant programs, which I know is exceptionally important to you. And so I thank you for your work and your support in the past. And we look forward to continuing to work with you and the other bipartisan senators who were here before. I think it's very important that we move urgently to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act. And of course, we are grateful that the Congress, when the Violence Against Women Act lapsed, that the funding programs continued to be funded because they, as we know, provide urgent services. But as Senator Ernst and others said, it is very important that we strengthen, improve, and indeed modernize the Violence Against Women Act. So we stand ready to work with you, Senator, and others to make sure we can get that done.
Okay. Some years ago, this committee approved the Survivors' Bill of Rights for sexual assault. This year, I'm working with colleagues on related legislation that would provide states with additional funding under the STOP formula grant program authorized by VAWA if they adopt legislation to implement these same rights at the state level. I remain concerned, however, that only a minority of sexual assault victims come forward and report the crime. Other than adopting the Survivors' Bill of Rights, what additional steps might federal, state, local authorities take to encourage more victims of sexual assault to report the crime and cooperate in its investigation?
Well, first, Senator, thank you for your leadership on ensuring survivors, regardless whether in the state system or the federal system, receive the services and the rights that they deserve. I think the simple answer to your question, Senator, is reauthorization of VAWA, and it is at the levels that the President has sought, because that will expand the much-needed, indeed urgently needed services. I spent some time with a number of advocates last week, and I heard from them that, frankly and unfortunately, the demand for services is far outpacing the availability of those services. We have waiting lines at places like rape trauma and rape crisis centers, critical rape crisis centers that VAWA funds. So I think the simple answer, Senator, is reauthorization and the increased funding that the President is seeking.
Okay. My last question will have to be about the federal courts having authority to award restitution for certain losses incurred by victims of crime in federal cases. And the Government Accountability Office recommended several years ago that the Department of Justice implement performance measures and goals for the collection of restitution. To what extent has DOJ implemented those reforms, and what can you tell us about the subject?
Well, Senator, I'll have to go back and look at that specific report and our responses, although I know that we take very seriously reports from whether it's the GAO or the IG, and particularly when it comes to stewardship of federal dollars.
Could you respond to that in writing then?
I'd be happy to, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Senator Grassley. Senator Leahy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Deputy Attorney General, it's great to see you here. I've had the pleasure of working with you over the years. You talked about being a junior staff member here. You were a very vital staff member right from day one, and I appreciate
Thank you.
being here on this, and I can't think of anybody better to be talking about Violence Against Women Act. It's one of the most consequential pieces of legislation within our committee's jurisdiction. Fortunately, last time successfully reauthorized was in 2013. I was glad in that one when Senator Crapo and I brought the bill through. We had students, immigrants, LGBTQ individuals, those on tribal land. And it passed overwhelmingly. But those of us who, our days as prosecutors, saw what happened in violence against women, not a statistic, but actually saw the victims. I talked to the victims, those who were still alive and could talk. So I'm glad you're here. I think you would agree that it's important to not only reauthorize, but improve and strengthen the law. Would you agree with that?
I do, Senator.
And I think back often to my own experience. Many of us had experience as prosecutors. When you see the impacts of domestic and sexual violence on individuals, on their communities, we also know that one size doesn't fit all in the criminal justice system. I've been looking at things like restorative justice principles and practices. Maybe they can help those empower survivors to have a voice in shaping the response to harm. And it gives them and their communities an opportunity to make sure that those who caused the harm be accountable for their actions. I've been working with your Justice Department to establish the federally backed National Center on Restorative Justice. I'm familiar with it because it's housed within the Vermont Law School. The center received initial funding from the Office of Justice Programs, received another Justice Department grant earlier this year to continue, and I appreciate that. Both the House Representatives and the White House have expressed support for continuing and expanding it as needed. So, a long way around to come to the question, we have to reauthorize, we have to improve in the existing law. I think utilizing restorative justice approaches is one of those necessary improvements. So Deputy Attorney General Monaco, we're working to finalize restorative justice language within the Senate Vawa legislation. Will you support exploring restorative justice as another approach to reducing domestic and sexual violence in our communities?
Yes, Senator, and just to give you a sense of my thinking on this, I start from the premise that the original Violence Against Women Act, at its core, was about improving responses, as we've talked about, improving responses to domestic violence, dating violence, stalking, sexual assault, and improving the response of law enforcement in the courts. It had been treated as a private matter, and we had to innovate, and we had to change our thinking. And as has been noted before, earlier this morning, the hallmark of reauthorizations of VAWA in the past has been filling gaps and innovating and improving and modernizing our services. And what I have heard from advocates and from experts is that some survivors are reticent to seek help from the criminal justice system. And so they need other options. I think those options need to be evidence-based, they need to be voluntary, but I think a hallmark of violence against women in the past and in the future ought to be being willing to study and innovate and be responsive to what we're seeing on the ground. So yes, Senator, and I'm very pleased that OJP and the Bureau of Justice Assistance has been able to fund the Restorative Justice Center you mentioned in Vermont.
Well, I appreciate that, and I have a feeling that at least the Senate Appropriations Committee will make sure the money is there that you may need on this. And and you alluded to this, now I'll close with this. I think back and with a distressed memory, a number of cases when I was a prosecutor, when a victim of violence against women, sometimes no longer alive, would come forward, we find this has been going on for some time, and that person never felt they had a place they could go to report it. And I have often said, I was distressed in my office as state's attorney to hear about it for the first time as we're ordering the autopsy. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Leahy. Senator Cornyn.
Deputy Attorney General Monaco, thank you for being here today. I'm actually a little surprised to see you, given the fact that you refused to attend the hearing where the heinous conduct of Larry Nassar was exposed again, and where even the FBI director personally apologized, saying he was deeply and profoundly sorry to the victims of these repeated sexual assaults while they were Olympic athletes. Let me just ask you to respond to a statement that was reported in The Hill. This is by one of the witnesses there, former U.S. Olympic gymnast Allie Raceman. She attended a news conference that Senator Blumenthal and Senator Grassley held. And as you know, Senator Blumenthal, Senator Feinstein had both written a letter to you and the Attorney General asking serious questions, asking for you to appear at the hearing that we held 3 weeks ago. But Ms. Raceman, one of the victims of repeated sexual assault by the Olympic team doctor, said, the message by them not showing up sends that child abuse doesn't matter. She's talking about the Department of Justice, talking about you. I think it's completely shocking and disturbing that they didn't think it was important. What's your response?
Senator, I think that the women who came and testified here last month are exceptionally brave. Their voices were powerful.
They're talking about you not showing up. And that was essentially a disrespectful act, which did not view the allegations that they have made against Mr. Nassar as sufficiently significant for the Department of Justice to actually show up for the hearing.
I'm deeply and profoundly sorry for the fact that the victims and courageous survivors, both the women who testified last month and the scores, unfortunately scores of other survivors of Larry Nassar, did not receive.
Why didn't you or the Attorney General show up at the hearing?
Senator, I think the committee, and I thank the committee for its work, was able to hear from Director Wray and the Inspector General.
Don't you know that you demonstrated profound disrespect for these victims of sexual assault by your refusal to respond to Senator Blumenthal, Senator Feinstein's letter, or to even show and express your personal apology as the public official responsible for supervising the FBI at the Department of Justice? Don't you think you showed them disrespect by refusal to show?
I mean, no disrespect, Senator, and I am here to answer whatever questions the committee has with regard to the steps the department is taking to ensure that the failures, the inexcusable failures, fundamental failures, do not happen again. I welcome the committee's questions here today on that subject.
Well, you're about 3 weeks too late by my count. A lot of the initial failures of the FBI occurred in 2015. We're now in 2021. And despite the Department of Justice's refusal to act on the criminal referral by the Inspector General, now you tell us 6 years later that the Department of Justice is reviewing new information and has a sense of urgency and gravity over these potential criminal prosecutions. You know, I've been in Washington long enough to know there's a difference between what people say and what they do. And when you're talking about a 6-year delay between the time that the outcry of these victims of sexual assault is made and 6-year delay between then and now, it's pretty hard to understand or to believe that there is any sense of urgency or gravity on the part of the Department of Justice. What is the statute of limitations for lying to the FBI or from some of the other potential criminal activities that have been charged by the Inspector General in this case?
I believe the statute of limitations, I want to confirm for 1001, which I think is the statute referencing, is 5 years.
So here we are 6 years later. Isn't it likely that any criminal charges for lying to the FBI would be barred by the statute of limitations?
Senator Cornyn, I really don't want to get into the specifics about what legal theories could be pursued, what evidence may
No, I'm asking
be pursued.
you about the statute of limitations. You said it's 5 years for lying to the FBI. Here we are 6 years later, and the Department of Justice has done nothing. And you have the audacity to tell us that you are experiencing a sense of urgency and gravity over this. It's simply not credible.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you. Welcome, Ms. Monaco. Good to have you back in the committee again.
Thank you, Senator.
We had another exceptionally brave and powerful witness with allegations of sexual assault in this committee before the Olympic athletes, and that was Dr. Christine Blasey Ford. In response to that testimony, the Republicans hired a prosecutor to try to punch holes in her testimony. And when that failed, it appears that the FBI tanked the background investigation. Just for starters, is there any reason that sexual assault allegations should be taken less seriously in the context of a background investigation than in the context of a criminal investigation?
Sexual assault allegations should always be taken seriously, Senator.
And let me thank you for the trickle of information that has begun to flow about the FBI's conduct in that matter. As you know, Director Wray maintained a complete stonewall on information about that investigation during the Trump administration, while at the same time maintaining a fast lane for FBI information related to the Crossfire Hurricane investigation. Why there should be two different gates at the FBI for information related to these two investigations is something that we'd like to try to understand further, and I hope you'll continue to cooperate in extracting from the FBI the information that we need to understand what took place. Will you?
We will, Senator, and I'm pleased that the FBI has responded to, I think, your most recent letter on this matter, has offered a briefing on the matter, and you have my commitment. We will continue to make sure that we do our very best to answer your questions.
So more generally, I have a letter that I'd like to put into the record, Mr. Chairman, from, it's been anonymized, which I think is appropriate, from a victim of domestic violence, related to her experience with a Rhode Island group called Sojourner House, which, among its other services, provides transitional housing so that the victim of violence can go and find a place to live while she or he works through all the changes in their lives that dealing with that violence threat requires. So I'd like to put that on the record without objection. And relatedly, years ago, the last time I guess we reauthorized the Vawa Act, we got my Smart Prevention Act into it, which provides funding to help kids right? The woman is often the direct victim of domestic violence, but a child witnessing that violence has been through a terrible ordeal also that can affect them for a long time. Could you speak, please, to the role of housing in providing adequate support for victims of domestic violence and the support that children, particularly very young children, need when they may not be the subject of the violence itself, but they are nevertheless witness to it and traumatized by that experience in their family?
Well, thank you, Senator. I'm glad you highlighted this issue because I think too often it's overlooked, the ripple effect from domestic violence. And as you rightly point out, the woman is often the direct victim, but it does ripple out. And unfortunately, the most vulnerable, the children, are often in that wake and feeling those effects as acutely as the primary victim. Towards that end, the Violence Against Women Act and its transitional housing program funds much needed, frankly, refuge for people fleeing domestic violence and violent situations. I think the latest figure I saw, Senator, is some 2 million housing nights a year that the Violence Against Women Act's transitional housing program funds through its grant recipients. The president's budget request seeks additional funding, an increase in that, and it's much needed. As I said, I've heard directly from advocates in the last week just how much demand is outpacing supply. And so I think you've hit on a very critical issue, and I look forward to working with the members of this committee to really making sure we address that issue of transitional housing and having a refuge for women and their children who are too often in the line of fire, so to speak, when it comes to domestic violence.
Last point in my 15 seconds remaining, I hope the administration will support the proposed increase in the SMART prevention funding related to child witnesses of domestic violence from $15 million to $45 million. It's a little bit hard when we're talking about $2 trillion here and $3.5 trillion there to imagine that for this population we're at 15 million. But I hope the administration will support increasing that.
Thanks, Senator Whitehouse. Senator Hawley.
Mr. Chairman, I'll let Senator Cotton go next. He was here before me.
Senator Cotton.
Ms. Monaco, last week the National School Board Association wrote to President Biden asking the administration to bring the full force and weight of the feds down onto parents who are protesting various school policies at school board meetings, including the indoctrination of children with an anti-American doctrine known as critical race theory, or protesting the requirement that children as young as 2 be required to wear masks. Now, I think we can all agree that violence is not an acceptable form of political protest, and violence can never be used to achieve policy or political goals. But that's not what the School Board Association letter focuses on. In fact, in one example of what the association thinks warrants federal criminal charges, they cite, and this is a direct quote, an individual who prompted a school board to call a recess because of opposition to critical race theory. A recess. The association is asking the administration to use the Patriot Act, a law that this Congress passed and has repeatedly reauthorized, primarily to stop the threat of Islamic jihadists, to bring criminal charges for domestic terrorism against parents who attend school boards to oppose things like critical race theory or mask mandates, resulting in a recess being called. Ms. Monaco, is it domestic extremism for a parent to advocate for their child's best interests?
Well, Senator, as you rightly point out, that violence is not the answer. There can be very spirited public debate, and there should be very spirited public debate on a whole host of issues. But when that tips over into violence or threats, there is a role for law enforcement.
Ms. Monaco, I'm sorry, my time is limited here, and I asked a simple yes or no question, and I have several of them that I want to ask. So I'd like a yes or no answer. Is it domestic extremism for a parent to advocate for their child's best interests?
I think what you have described, no, I would not describe as domestic extremism.
Domestic extremism for a parent to want to have a say in what their child is taught at school?
I think it's important, although obviously not my field in the Justice Department, to opine on education policy. It's important for parents' voices to be heard. But, Senator, I want to talk about what the Attorney General did do in response to that,
I want
the issue of threats.
Ms. Monaco, I want to go through my question. I grant you that no one no one should ever threaten violence or use violence to try to achieve political or policy goals. They shouldn't, for instance, follow Democratic senators into the bathroom violating state laws. No one should ever use threats of violence or violence to achieve political goals. I'm asking very simple questions here and trying to get to the bottom of what was on the Attorney General's mind or the Department's mind. Is it domestic extremism for parents to oppose their children being taught to treat people differently because of race?
The Justice Department's job, Senator, is to apply facts to law, not to opine on letters that are put forward or, I think it's very important for the Justice Department to...
Ms. Monaco, it's a fact that the School Board Association just sent this letter to President Biden, and then conveniently the Attorney General released his letter yesterday describing his series of measures to confront this grave and growing threat of parents protesting their kids being indoctrinated and the school board having to call a recess. Is there any connection between those two things?
I want to be very clear, and the memorandum that's publicly available, the Attorney General issued, talks about the importance of bringing federal, state, local law enforcement together to make sure that there is awareness of how to report threats that may occur, and to ensure that there's an open line of communication to address threats, to address violence, and to address law enforcement issues in that context, which is the job of the Justice Department, nothing more.
The United States just saw the largest single-year increase in murders on record. Has the Attorney General issued a memorandum describing a special series of measures that the Department of Justice should take to try to address this record increase in murders?
Yes, indeed, Senator. In fact, I issued a directive to the field
You did.
earlier this year.
As the Attorney General.
It was on behalf of the Attorney General and the rest of the leadership of the Justice Department to address the alarming rise in violent crime and to lay out a strategy for violent crime reduction, which includes going after and using federal resources to target the most violent offenders, including those operating with guns, including those responsible for murders and violence in our communities. So absolutely, we take the alarming rise in violent crime exceptionally seriously. And indeed, I've heard from the many hours I have spent with law enforcement leaders across this country how urgently they feel it is to address this rise in violent crime. And we are working every day to address that challenge.
I just want to finish with one final question. Did anyone at the FBI express disagreement or any reticence at all about investigating disagreements between parents and school boards over curriculums and school policies?
I don't understand that to have been it absolutely was not the subject of the Attorney General's memorandum, but the answer to your question is no.
Nobody at the FBI expressed any reticence.
I'm sorry, Senator, if you're asking me what was the response to the Attorney General's memorandum, I've heard no reticence, no concern. The job of U.S. attorneys and FBI special agents in charge to be conveners in their community, to address violent issues in their community, is the core job of the Justice Department.
All right, then.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. And Senator Klobuchar, prior to your arrival, we said good things about you and your work on Vawa.
Well, better than bad things. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your leadership. I apologize for being late. We're having an incredible hearing over in the Commerce Committee on the whistleblowers, allegations, and statements about Facebook. And I was thinking as I sat there, despite all of the hearings that we've had in this committee, it may be that one person is going to be the catalyst to finally passing bills, not just in the privacy area, which she herself said isn't enough, but in transparency for algorithms and also consolidation, which was specifically mentioned with the dominant platforms. Ms. Monaco, I know we're going to have a confirmation hearing on your new nominee for antitrust, but I only lead with that because the violent content is a part of this story as well. I would start with the fact that this has always been a bipartisan reauthorization so many times in the past. This bill is so important. And in your view, has the pandemic, where we saw in my own state intimate partner violence rose more than 40% in 2020, has the pandemic increased the urgency to reauthorize Vawa?
Absolutely, it has, Senator. And have been remarking this morning on my discussions with advocates and service providers, the people on the ground doing the work that is so urgently funded by the Violence Against Women Act, they have told me that the demand for services is outpacing the ability to provide those services, and it's only become more so as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, which stands to reason. People are at home and really, with their abuser in many respects, and that is a horrible situation that we need to rectify.
Okay. For many years, I've worked with Senator Cornyn on the Abbey Honold Act, something that Senator Franken was originally involved in introducing. And this bill would encourage law enforcement's use of trauma-informed techniques when responding to sexual assault crimes to avoid re-traumatizing the victim. Can you speak to why it's important that law enforcement uses these types of techniques? This bill was actually included in the House-passed reauthorization of Vawa.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for your leadership on that issue. It is such an exceptionally important part of the Violence Against Women Act and our approach to these issues, understanding from the survivor's perspective what they're going through when they are interviewed by law enforcement, when they interact with the court system, when they go to get their medical exam as a result of a sexual assault that they have suffered. Making sure that at every step along the way, the individuals they are encountering understand the trauma that the victim and survivor has encountered so that they can take appropriate steps, so they can recognize and have their services be, as we say, trauma-informed, where the victim's experience is at the center of the training that service providers provide.
Thank you. I want to move on to something really important to me, and that is the fact that every year more than 600 American women are killed with a gun by intimate partners, and half of the women killed by intimate partners are killed by dating partners. When Senator Leahy was chairing this committee, we had a hearing on what's called the Boyfriend Loophole, which always sounds too positive to me, actually, for what it means. And a conservative witness, actually all the Republican witnesses, I remember Senator Grassley being at this hearing as well, supported changing this situation. As they said, dangerous boyfriends can be just as scary, the sheriff from Racine County, Wisconsin said, as dangerous husbands. They hit just as hard and they fire their guns with the same deadly force. Yet federal law only prohibits domestic abusers from buying a gun if they are currently or formerly married, if they have ever lived together, if they had a child with the victim. Do you agree that we should update the law, and I know you addressed this earlier, in order to protect dating partners in the same way we protect married partners?
Absolutely, Senator. The danger and the violence and the risk to the women who are suffering and who are killed, we know that women are more likely to be killed if the abuser has a gun, and it's no different if that abuser is in a dating relationship than if they are a spouse.
And I also know when the Congress first took action to prohibit convicted domestic abusers, this was on a bipartisan basis, from buying or owning a gun, the restriction applied to people who, of course, already had convictions on the books. They didn't wipe the slate clean. Do you agree that fully addressing the threat means that abusive dating partners with prior domestic violence convictions should be prohibited from buying a gun? That's what's in the bill now, the bill that, by the way, passed the House with dozens of Republican votes.
I think it's exceptionally important that we address this loophole. The individuals, as you said, are people who would be affected by this, are people who've been adjudicated, who've been convicted and found to be a threat by a court. That's the issue that we have to address, and because failure to close this loophole is resulting in too many women dying.
Really appreciate your leadership and your testimony today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Monaco, I want to come back to this extraordinary letter and memorandum that the Attorney General of the United States issued yesterday. Practically every day brings new reports about this administration weaponizing the federal bureaucracy to go after political opponents. Frankly, I don't think we've ever seen anything like it in American history. I mean, for those of us who missed the McCarthy era, I guess this president is intent on bringing it to us, but with new force and new power and new urgency, unlike anything we've ever seen. Are you aware of any time in American history when an attorney general has directed the FBI to begin to intervene in school board meetings, local school board meetings?
I'm not aware, and I'm not aware that is not going on. Let me be very,
Really,
very
this
clear.
isn't about local school board meetings? That's not the subject of the memorandum? I thought that was in the memorandum.
The memorandum is quite clear. It's one page, and it asks the U.S. attorney community and the FBI special agents in charge to convene state and local law enforcement partners to ensure that there's an open line of communication to address threats, to address violence, and that's the appropriate role of the Department of Justice to make sure that we are addressing criminal conduct and violence.
At local school board meetings, let me just ask you this. Is parents waiting sometimes for hours to speak at a local school board meeting to express concerns about critical race theory or the masking of their students, particularly young children? Is that in and of itself, is that harassment and intimidation? Is waiting to express one's view at a school board meeting harassment and intimidation?
As the Attorney General's memorandum made quite clear, spirited debate is welcome, is a hallmark of this country. It's something we all should engage in. And
no, I don't think so, Ms. Monaco. With all due respect, it didn't make it quite clear. It doesn't define those terms, nor does it define harassment or intimidation. It talks about violence. I think we can agree that violence shouldn't be condoned or looked aside from in any way, swept under the rug at all. But harassment and intimidation, what did those terms mean in the context of a local school board meeting? I mean, this seems to, in the First Amendment context, we talk about the chill to speech. If this isn't a deliberate attempt to chill parents from showing up at school board meetings for their elected school boards, I don't know what is. I mean, I'm not aware of anything like this in American history. We're talking about the FBI. You're using the FBI to intervene in school board meetings. That's extraordinary.
Senator, I have to respectfully disagree. That is not what...
Point me to an instance.
The Attorney General's memorandum made quite clear that violence is not appropriate. Spirited public debate on a whole range of issues is absolutely what this country is all about.
Then why is it being investigated by the FBI?
It is not. When and if any situation turns to violence, then that is the appropriate role of law enforcement to address it.
The memorandum covers more than violence. It talks about intimidation. It talks about harassment. So I'm asking you to draw some lines. We do this all the time in the First Amendment context. This is the sum and substance of First Amendment law, so I expect that you'll be available and willing to do it now. Tell me where the line is with parents expressing their concerns, waiting for hours in these school board meetings. We've all seen the videos. This happened in my state. Parents have waited for hours. Sometimes the school board meetings have been ended before they can speak because the school board doesn't want to hear it. And now parents are told that if they wait and they express their views, that they may be investigated for intimidation?
I don't know who's telling them that, Senator. The job of the Justice Department is to investigate crimes. When a situation turns to violence, when and if a situation turns to violence, it's the job of the Justice Department and local law enforcement to address that. The Attorney General's memorandum simply asked the U.S. attorney community, the FBI, and their counterparts to ensure that state and local law enforcement has an open line of communication to report threats, whether they happen in the context of election officials being threatened, whether they happen in the context of members of Congress being threatened, which the FBI responds to on a regular basis, as is appropriate. The job of the Justice Department is to address criminal conduct.
You know, all I can say is this is truly extraordinary. I think you know it is. It's unprecedented. You can't point to a single instance where anything like this has happened before. And I think parents across this country are going to be stunned to learn, stunned, that if they show up at a local school board meeting, by the way, where they have the right to appear and be heard, where they have the right to say something about their children's education, where they have the right to vote, and you are attempting to intimidate them. You are attempting to silence them. You are attempting to interfere with their rights as parents and, yes, with their rights as voters. This is wrong. This is dangerous. And I cannot believe that an Attorney General of the United States is engaging in this kind of conduct. And frankly, I can't believe that you are sitting here today defending it. I intend to get answers to these questions. You won't answer my questions. I'm going to get answers to these questions. Mr. Chairman, we need to have a hearing on this subject. We need to hear from the Attorney General himself. He needs to come here, take the oath, sit there, and answer questions. We have never seen anything like this before in our country's history. And frankly, I want to say I think it is a dangerous, dangerous precedent.
This hearing on Violence Against Women Act will continue. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin. Great to be with you, Deputy Attorney General Monaco, and I appreciate your appearing before us on a hearing that is about the reauthorization and strengthening of the Violence Against Women Act, a tremendously positive and important law that you helped shape when it was first brought forward by then Senator Biden in this committee. It's one of the most important pieces of legislation Congress has passed in recent memory. It's improved and protected the lives of millions of Americans and transformed the way that our country and law enforcement, advocates, and victims think about and respond to domestic violence. It's also, in my view, a testament to President Biden's vision and character, someone who has always had an intense opposition to those who abuse their power over others. It still remains far too pervasive in our country, and domestic violence in many ways has been worsened by the COVID-19 pandemic. I've gotten calls from the Delaware nonprofit organizations that are both advocates and service providers. And I think it's more critical than ever that Congress strengthen and reauthorize this bill. So let me ask a few questions on that topic, if I might. Gun violence is a pervasive and tragic, brutal part of domestic violence and gender-based violence. Studies show domestic violence is 5 times more likely to be deadly if an abuser has access to a firearm. I was glad to see that the bipartisan House-passed Vawa reauthorization would require the federal government to tell state and local authorities when a person with a domestic abuse conviction has failed a background check. Similarly, Senator Cornyn and I introduced in this chamber the NICS Denial Notification Act, which would require information sharing between federal, state, and local law enforcement when a person prohibited tries to purchase a firearm and fails a background check. Would you agree that giving state and local authorities timely information about individuals who've lied and tried and been denied a firearm can help make our communities safer?
Absolutely, Senator. What we need to make sure is we've got the requisite information in the systems to ensure that those who pose a risk, those who pose a lethal risk, cannot possess a firearm and do deadly damage in our communities.
One of the roles I play here is as a member of the Appropriations Committee, and in particular the subcommittee that provides funding for federal law enforcement and for the implementation of VAWA. The authorization levels haven't gone up as rapidly as the need. And I've heard from providers like the YWCA, Child Inc., Community Legal Aid in my home state about how this makes a daily difference, the resources that they receive through VAWA. How can we continue to support nonprofit organizations all over the country, an established network of providers and advocates, and account for the extra need that the COVID-19 pandemic has placed on them?
Well, Senator, you've hit at the heart of the matter, which is the really dangerous increase in the need that survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, stalking, sexual assault have, and it's increased during the pandemic, as we've observed. Those who are stuck at home, housed with their abuser, are suffering, and suffering sometimes in silence. And so the simple answer to your question, Senator, is reauthorizing the Violence Against Women Act, and doing so at the $1 billion levels that the President has requested in his FY 2022 budget request. It will provide much needed, indeed urgent, services to survivors, training to law enforcement so they respond, and when they do so, they've got the tools, the training they need not to re-traumatize the survivors who they're encountering, and it will do the same with regard to court systems, increase rural funding for these same services. Senator Ernst rightly pointed out that we need to make sure that rural communities get these services as well, and the Office of Violence Against Women's rural program does that. We need to increase those funds as well. So reauthorizing the critical and frankly landmark programs of the Violence Against Women Act is really what we need to be doing.
I was glad this hearing began with a panel of 3 Republican senators here testifying to the significance of VAWA, and in particular, Senator Ernst talking about her own experiences and now her engagement and advocacy. Let me ask a last question on this, if I might. Many survivors of domestic violence struggle to find rental housing. Often they have poor credit or employment or rental histories directly as a result of their abuse. How can Congress ensure survivors don't face needless barriers to accessing affordable housing, which is one of the main reasons those who are abused stay with their abusers, is they don't see a path forward towards being able to house their family free from abuse?
You're quite right, Senator. We need to make sure that there's a refuge. There's a safe haven, if you will, for people, women and their children, oftentimes fleeing an abuser. And there needs to be a place for them to go. The transitional housing program that the Violence Against Women Act funds and has funded historically provides millions of housing nights a year for just that exact purpose, to give that safe haven. And we need to reauthorize it, and we need to increase the funding to it.
Thank you, Deputy Attorney General. Mr. Chairman, could I ask for 1 minute of forbearance?
I guess. Yes, of course.
The senator who preceded me in questioning you accused the Attorney General and the administration of an unprecedented level of FBI harassment and intimidation of citizens at school board meetings. Is there any foundation to this?
No, sir.
Just thought I'd give you a chance to answer that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Coons. Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing, and also thanks to Ranking Member Grassley. I look forward to us moving ahead and providing more resources and more support to families and victims of domestic violence. I think over the last 18 or 20 months, COVID has not only taken lives as a result of the disease, but we've seen an increase in domestic violence and child abuse. So it's very timely that we have this hearing, and very important that we make progress. I want to talk, Ms. Monaco, about some of the plumbing that we should look at. You know, we installed the plumbing back in 1994. We had a GAO report in 2012 that talked about the DOJ lacking visibility or the extent to which the programs overlap. I think in 2018 we had another Inspector General report that 42% of Vawa grants had not been closed on a timely basis. So as we're looking ahead at maybe well-intentioned programs, but maybe they need to be repurposed, modernized, consolidated, do you have any thoughts about what we should focus on in terms of the plumbing of Vawa so that we can get maximum resources to those who need it and free it up to address rural and other concerns that were expressed in the hearing today?
Well, thanks very much, Senator. And I think you're quite right to focus on the specifics of how we're making sure we're getting that funding out to the people who need it, and how we make sure that we're using that those dollars to their best effect. As you know, the Violence Against Women Act funds these critical programs, and then recipients of those grants have to file regular financial reports and reports on the services they are providing. The fact that I could tell Senator Whitehouse that there are 2 million transitional housing nights a year with those grant recipient fundings is because of those reports. Now, I think we have to be exceptionally diligent in how we are monitoring the use of those funds, and I'm confident that we have the capability to do that. And I'm also pleased that we have been able to get out the funds for the Violence Against Women Act, for the Office of Violence Against Women's 2021 funding that would have expired on September 30th of this year had we not gotten it all out the door to the people who need it, and we've been able to do that, and nearly $500 million in those funds as of September 30th.
Thank you. I think as we go through this process, it would be very important just to see how the administration of the program and the future oversight can be improved and modernized. We would appreciate that feedback.
Happy to work with you, Senator, on that. And I know this is an area of particular focus for you.
Thank you. Also, just kind of curious about DOJ audits on grantees and victims. Can you give me an update on the audit process and, generally speaking, how the outcomes are generally speaking to the outcomes?
Well, Senator, as I said, the VAWA programs themselves in the Office of Violence Against Women does require regular reporting on the use of the funds, how those funds are being distributed, what services are happening as a result, and that's a very, very important part of the success of VAWA, being able to see where dollars are effective and add to those, and where they're not, to look at other innovative ways to expand and provide services.
What about things that could help us as we move forward with reauthorization and modernization in the area of best practices? I went to a facility that just recently opened in Western North Carolina, which is extraordinary. Their safe transition, their employment outcomes they have to be in the top quartile, if not the top decile. So how could we better understand programs that seem to be working and really try to set that bar high? Everybody's trying to do good. I understand that, but some programs are clearly producing better results than others. So what information could we get from the DOJ to really instruct us on the kinds of things that we believe are leading edge and making sure that our resources are going to the ones that are producing the best results?
Well, first, I'd say that I'd be happy to give you a more in-depth briefing about how we identify the best programs and best practices. I view it as the job of the Department of Justice, through the Office of Justice Programs, Violence Against Women Office, the COPS Office, to basically be a force multiplier and an identifier of best practices, to lift those up, see where great innovative work is being done in the states, in local communities, because that's what it's all about. The federal government absolutely doesn't have the best information on this. We need to identify the great work that is going on locally, fund it, and then expand it and give it a broader audience.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Tillis. Before I recognize Senator Hirono, since it has been a recurring theme from some members about the memorandum that was issued yesterday by the Attorney General, I now have a copy of it in hand, as well as the press release from the Department of Justice, which without objection I'm going to enter into the record so everyone can read the actual words printed. And it is worth noting that the opening of the memo is, quote, "In recent months, there has been a disturbing spike in harassment, intimidation, and threats of violence against school administrators, board members, teachers, staff who participate in the vital work of running our nation's public schools." And it goes on with more specifics, how the Attorney General is seeking to coordinate with local and state law enforcement for the protection of all school personnel. That is clearly the intent of this. Those who believe that somehow or another violence or something close to it is a valid use of constitutional right, I couldn't disagree more. There are many who describe the January 6th occurrence here in the Capitol as just a visit by ordinary tourists. For those of us who lived through it, know better. And anyone who wants to characterize that as an ordinary constitutional process wasn't here and isn't being honest, whether they've said that publicly or were outside cheering the group on. So I want to make a record of that, and I'm going to add the press release as well from the Department of Justice, which goes into more detail on the subject. Senator Hirono, thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for clarifying what's actually in the letter or memorandum that was issued by the Attorney General yesterday. It's always surprising to me that lawyers on this committee don't seem to understand the legitimate exercise of First Amendment rights and people who are threatening violence and, in fact, who engage in assaults on people. So you would think that we would all be able to come together to pass VAWA, and I thank you, Ms. Monaco, for your testimony and your responses to the urgent need to reauthorize VAWA and at an increased level, because the need is definitely there. One group that I wanted to call your attention to is that there is an unfortunately high instance of intimate partner violence within the Native Hawaiian community, which, as an indigenous community, parallel the high instances of domestic violence experienced by and exhibited within American Indian and Alaska Native communities. And as we move forward with combating domestic violence, I'd like to get your commitment to work with my office to address this disparity and better serve Native communities, because we can do a far better job for these communities.
I absolutely agree, Senator. It's one of the priorities laid out in my opening testimony is exactly this, making sure that we are addressing the underserved to include Indigenous communities.
Thank you. And in particular, we need to fix Vawa to ensure that Native Hawaiian organizations are eligible for funding from the Office of Violence Against Women's Tribal Coalitions program. I hope that you'll give your support to that change. There was some discussion already about how women in these situations often do not have options. And often they will leave their job not because they're fired, but because of domestic violence. And so we want to make sure that these victims and survivors have access to unemployment insurance benefits. And I think that that is an important aspect of what we need to do with the Vawa reauthorization. Would you agree?
Thank you, Senator. I know that the Office of Justice Programs is exploring how we can ensure that individuals have the assistance they need to kind of be a bridge to the services they need to get to.
Yeah, so I think that we need to view UI benefits as more than just in the circumstances where someone loses a job or is fired. We know that protecting immigrant survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking is particularly a concern for the immigrant community. Can you talk about how important it is for Vawa to be there for all survivors, and also how it's been able to assist immigrant victims of violence?
Well, I think what's really important, Senator, and you rightly point out that an individual shouldn't be kind of held hostage by their abuser, and they need to be able to seek immigration relief, as it were, on their own. And I think some of them, we'll see where the Senate bill, what that yields, but I think it's something that we very much want to be supportive of, making sure that a individual who not have to rely on their abuser to file a petition for immigration status.
Yeah, I think immigrant women are particularly vulnerable, those who are undocumented. And immigration has become a very divisive issue, and it is really important that we continue to provide these protections and services for immigrant women and for undocumented women in Vawa. I'd ask for your continued support in that. Mr. Chairman, those are the questions I have for the moment.
Thanks, Senator Rono. And once again, thanks for your patience in waiting during this hearing. I want to thank Deputy Attorney General Monaco, as well as Senators Ernst, Hyde-Smith, and Capito for joining us today. Statistics suggest that an average of nearly 20 people per minute are physically abused by an intimate partner in the United States, 20 per minute. That means that over the course of this hearing, hundreds of Americans experience domestic violence. With the passage of Vawa in 1994, we reduced incidents of domestic violence and significantly improved support services, but there's still much more to do. I couldn't start to list the number or names of the organizations that provide services and support to survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. Many of them have submitted testimony for the record today, and without objection, their statements will be not only entered into the record, but valued for their content. I look forward to introducing the Violence Against Women Act Reauthorization Act with Senators Ernst and Feinstein and many of our colleagues quickly. We want to move on this. We need to get this bill to a president who's anxious to receive it as well and sign it into law for reauthorization. Welcome back to the Judiciary Committee, and I really value your presence and testimony today. The committee will stand.